Hiring managers of Reddit. What's your favorite? They were perfect until we Googled them. Story. Really nice, clean-cut young man from the nearby college applies in my shop. Sweet, friendly, outgoing, and smart. He was perfect until we Googled him. He had a last name that was the same as a girl I had gone to school with. So I Googled his name, found his Facebook, and discovered that he was actually her little brother. I immediately called my friend, his sister, and said, "Hey, your brother just applied in my shop. I'm gonna hire him." She said, "Sweet, free ice cream." So he was perfect until I Googled him. And then he was even better. He worked for me for 2 years and he was an absolute delight. Ice cream, you scream, we all scream for ice cream! I was thinking of the Eddie Murphy bit and I somehow did a bad Seinfeld impression. Story 2. Oh, I've got a good one. We hired a new entry-level graphic designer. Let's call him Will. He had talent and a decent portfolio, but there were some strange things right from the beginning. For example, he would always come in wearing expensive suits. Despite our being a jeans and t-shirt office, him having a low-paid position, we didn't care much about that. No clue how he affords that wardrobe, but that's none of our business. He's a designer, and I guess he likes to look nice. The weirdest thing was that he adamantly refused to accept direct deposit for his paycheck. He wanted a physical check every other week. Strange, but okay. Designers are eccentric sometimes. So, one evening, we're all working really late on a project together. We've got some bottles of wine around, some pizzas, etc. It's miserably long hours, but we're a good team and having a good time. All of a sudden, Will looks up from his computer and freaking runs as fast as he can out the door. Not a word to any of us. He just dashes out. We all look at each other, trying calling him, etc., with no answer. We finish up the project and go home, still wondering what happened. The next day, Will doesn't come into work. He doesn't come in the next day either. We try calling his emergency contact, but don't get any responses there either. So we Google him and see the FBI press release. Turns out he was arrested about 500 miles from our office a few hours after he ran out. I guess he got a tip that the FBI was onto him and decided to make a run for it. Turns out he had been defrauding payroll companies for years to the tune of about $1 million. That's why he didn't want direct deposit for his paycheck. What he didn't know is that we processed our physical checks through the same payroll company as our direct deposit, and they reported his new address to the FBI. Oops. Story 3. I was hiring for our late night shifts ending at 2 a.m., 3 a.m., and she was willing to work anything and looking for about 25 hours per week. This was absolutely what the company was looking for. She had mentioned that she was grieving her little boy who passed 2 weeks ago and needed to do something to occupy her time. She finished her 1 day of computer training and stopped showing up. Later in the week, she sent me an email stating that she wasn't ready to come back to work like she'd thought, which was understandable. My assistant manager and I decided to look her up only to find that she had multiple GoFundMe pages set up for her sob story with different amounts of time that the supposed child had been dead for. Her Facebook was full of selfies and party photos. She ended up asking for the job back a few months later, and we shot her down pretty quick. Story 4. We had a near miss. One senior hire. We were talking about him and how something seemed a little off when we Googled him. It was like he didn't exist at all, and the odd, super positive tidbit of information that was always a bit too much of a stretch to be completely believable. I mean, 1 or 2 people saying you're the best thing on earth is one thing, but this was like all you got were these sporadic, hyper-manic observations. One of the junior members of the team pipes up at this point. She's overheard what we're talking about. Turns out she's worked the last 2 places that he's worked, and he's like a locust. He's extremely good at his job, but an absolute nightmare in all other ways. Sexual harassment, bullying, turning up wasted. He has a really niche skill set. There are always more roles than people to fill, so he hops along, bullies everyone out of their role in his team, brings in his entourage to the point where almost anyone normal rage quits because the atmosphere is so toxic. Then when HR tries to step in, he hits them with a constructive dismissal case and drags a lawyer in so there's no paper trail. She said he'd done it at her last job and the one before. It's one of those things that once you know, you start to notice stuff. So at events, when somebody mentioned this guy's name, half the table would just give each other a look, and the others would have no idea. It's not quite an open secret, but it's definitely on the grapevine anecdotally, if not formally. Glad we dodged that bullet. Story 5. Not the hiring manager, but I was the intern responsible for checking references and running backgrounds at our company, and this was in my first week where I was just learning how to go about things. This guy did great in the interview, so I got the go-ahead to run a background check and call his references. Something popped up in his background, so I had to call the police station to figure out how to get a copy of the police report since whatever happened had just happened. I talked to someone on the phone and gave them his name and who I was and what I was calling for. After doing so, whoever I was talking to didn't know how to go about obtaining the information on her end. She put me on a brief hold, then took a callback number and promised to call me back with some info. Well, it's a good thing neither of us knew what to do because I received a call from the police department less than an hour later. An officer told me, "I'm not really supposed to be doing this, but I just wanted to let you know that interview guy has been arrested for carjacking a woman and that woman works at your company." He saw the company name and the guy's name and warned us. I'm so grateful too. Let me clarify the timeline a bit. The woman was already working here. The guy applied, had a phone interview, then got called in for an in-person interview. And while we were still interviewing other candidates, this is when the crime was committed. So by the time I got the green light to pull the background check so that we could offer employment, it had been at least a month. Story 7. Somewhat the reverse. I was sharked by a guy who was running his own startup and looking for talent in my specific field. I liked the look of his company, his business model seemed viable, salary was competitive, and he offered equity. I was bored with my current position, so it was tempting. Out of curiosity, I Googled him and his email he contacted me through. His name was really common. Thinking maybe he used it to register anywhere else, his startup had no Glassdoor profile. I found a bunch of posts by him on a South African forum that were really racist against black people. He used the N-word at least once, was really aggressive. I declined the offer and linked him to what I had found that sealed my decision. He responded back saying he wished I'd reconsider, that those comments were somebody else. But he used his LinkedIn profile photo for his avatar. Edit. Because I've got someone could be pretending to be him a dozen times now, he registered on the site with the email he contacted me with. That's how I found him. I thought that was clear, but I suppose not. Always look up your potential employers, kids. Story 8. I used to manage a group home for developmentally disabled adults. I was in charge of hiring the staff that we needed to make the house run properly. I saw a name come across my desk that I had to interview and I instantly looked them up. Turns out this was a girl that had an obsessive crush on me from years ago, and her social media, she still did. I was in panic because she was basically stalking everything I did, and I really couldn't back out because it was 5 minutes before the interview. She came in, and it was so weird. She acted normal. We interviewed in a professional manner for about 15 minutes. Showed her around, and I thought, wow, maybe she has done some maturing, and I let it go. Then we got back to my office. I started a sentence like, "Well, it's been a pleasure having you here," and "Oh, no, we aren't done yet. You think you can ignore everything like you don't know what's going on? I know where you work now, I know where you live, and I'm going to keep calling." There was more she was saying along the lines of me telling her to kindly leave, but a phone call to the police, as well as a restraining order, kept her away from work and my life. Story 9. Years ago at my previous company, a few coworkers met a young man interested in a software development position with us at a local trade conference and invited him to come interview with us later that afternoon. Said fellow eagerly provided the link to his blog. Top post was about being recently released from probation after a stint for illicit drug sales and how his upstream supplier was kind enough to front him some startup capital and some new inventory to resume his little side gig, as his previous stash was allegedly confiscated during a previous visit by the law enforcement. So, coworkers and I decided to read a few more posts, just to make sure we didn't confuse him for the wrong guy and inadvertently got the wrong link. Sure enough, a few photos in, some older posts confirmed it was the same guy. We managed to get a little additional work done in the rest of the afternoon between speculation as to when his apparent commitment to full public discourse would land himself back in the clink and whether we ought to even mention having checked out his blog. We all had to try very hard to keep a straight face when he did come in for his interview. He actually was reasonably knowledgeable when it came to the job, and somehow we managed to completely avoid the question of his side gig in recreational pharmaceutical sales. We gave him an A+ for honesty and an F for having good sense. He was not extended an offer for employment. Story 10. Alright, I apologize in advance, but this needs a lot of setup. I worked for a service company. You know how places will outsource things like food service to Sodexo? Just hand off the entire department? That was how our company operated, except we specialized in maintenance, housekeeping, and laundry. I worked in the healthcare section of this place. I was assigned to a large nursing home and basically given charge of the whole department. I was a department head and sat at the big tail with the Don, director of social work, etc. The only difference was that they were employed by the facility and I was getting paid by a third-party company. This is important to all outsiders. I worked for this nursing home and so did my entire staff. We were constantly hiring housekeepers. It was a terrible job and the pay was horrific. You could make more money as a cashier at a convenience store without ever having to haul around giant contractor-sized garbage bags full of crappy adult diapers. So we always had jobs posted, and I always kept a stash of applications at the ready. One day I get a call from the front desk saying somebody wants to apply. I'm busy, fill out the app and leave it. Nope, she's insistent that she needs to see me. This is a big red flag given the terrible nature of this work. If you're that desperate for a job that is this terrible, then there is usually a frightening reason. But I meet with her anyway. She's nice, but just seems off. Work history is solid, she seems motivated, but there is just something striking me odd about this woman. She's early 60s. After she leaves, I immediately call my counterpart at the last place she worked. What she didn't know was that we both worked at the same company. That if she came to work for me, she'd be working back at the same company she'd just left. She likewise didn't know that we had the contract for all but 2 nursing homes in a 50-mile radius, and we were a close bunch. As soon as I mention the name, the other manager just yells, "Nope," into the phone. She'd been a CNA, but she was hired by that facility. She was brought back in as a housekeeper because we had 2 different HR systems, and she slipped through by switching shifts. She had been fired as a CNA for trading handies for drugs. She'd tug off the elderly resident in exchange for their pills, basically. As soon as the other guy found out, he fired her, but not before complaints hit his desk that the new housekeeper was up to her old shenanigans. Come to find out that her lengthy career was actually far worse than it looked on paper. She was an LPN for years, but lost her license and job for stealing drugs. She became a CNA because, at that time in my state, CNAs were certified, not by the state, but by private facilities. You got to call yourself a CNA if an RN worked through the 15-hour state-mandated training with you. But you just had proof of completion for the course as evidence of this. You didn't actually get licensed by the state, no longer the case. She basically would just change her job title. Jobs where she was a nurse on her resume became jobs where she was a CNA. Then after that shoe dropped, she just went back and said she'd been a housekeeper the whole time. She resurfaced some years later doing private duty personal care. Story 11. Slightly off topic but relevant. I heard we'd hired a new guy and so I looked him up on LinkedIn. Turns out he was just leaving a job where my father-in-law worked. I sent Pops a text and asked him about the new hire and opinions on him. Didn't get an answer. When I went for dinner the following weekend, I asked again. Turns out this new hire said he was leaving his former job to go and take care of his ailing mother in Africa. His former company said to not worry about it. Take an unpaid leave and come back when you can, however long it takes. I went in on Monday and told my boss. He didn't fire him immediately, but when he didn't perform well in his job after a couple of months, he got canned, and then proceeded to go back to his former company and tell them he was back from Africa. They did not rehire him. Story 12. Our organization was secular, though it had been originally founded by a Catholic bishop, and the organization's purpose was to resettle refugees coming into the U.S. for the first time. If you've done anything related to refugee resettlement, you'd know that many, if not most, of refugees coming to the U.S. are fleeing religious persecution of some variety. And 2, the USCCB, United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, is one of the largest players in the entire process, bringing over about 30% of the total refugees that come to the U.S. Also, it should be noted that our staff was extremely multi-ethnic and diverse, with many of the staff being former refugees themselves. Had a candidate, she seemed fine. Googled her, Holy Intolerance Batman, found a whole blog that she wrote about atheism. Okay, that's not a problem, but it was violent atheism. Things like how people who were caught in religious conflicts deserve to die for worshiping any sort of god, that they get what's coming to them. How she can't stand to be around people who worship any sort of god. Basically, her entire online presence was, if you believe in anything, you are awful and you're gonna die in a fire. She also didn't seem to be a big fan of non-white people either. So, hard pass on that one. Story 13. I was the admin assistant at a smallish company. There was a dude in IT who creeped me out. One time he called the office. Caller ID showed his last name but a different first name than I knew him by, and he just sat there silently on the line until I hung up. He also once pointed at where my necklace sat on my throat and said that if he stabbed me there, I'd bleed out in like 30 seconds. Another IT guy stepped in to take him back to their office. He'd tell big fish stories about his time in the military and show us scars on his hands and arms from deployment. Bear in mind that I was 22 at this point. This was my first big girl job after college. 10 years on, I realized I should have reported him and also bought some pepper spray. But at the time, I just thought he was weird and missed some serious red flags. So one day, this dude stops coming to work. After 3 days, his paperwork was terminated per policy, but IT being IT, they Googled the guy's name to see if he'd been in a terrible car accident or anything of the sort. What they found was even less expected. Turns out the two names thing was not him going by his middle name like I thought. No, he'd given one name for work to pass a background check, because the other name, the one that showed up on caller ID when he creeped on me, had warrants out for it. Sounds like the work name and attached social belonged to a relative. His military experience was a lie. The scars were from fights he'd gotten into over bad drug deals. He'd scammed people out of money to buy him a bulletproof jacket for his deployment. Someone he'd defrauded had made a website with his photo in various aliases, warning people to beware of his BS. In addition to the public arrest records it found. Oh, but it gets weirder. I worked with a friend, and we were at a party talking about this guy. And said friend pulled up to a tell-all site. Another friend gasped and said, "Holy crap, I know him." She worked at a condom sense, and that guy had been banned from the store for creeping on the employees. His adult content fetish was bizarrely specific and also involved ladies with my skin tone and hair color. Ew! The HR updated their screening policies after that, but one of my jobs from then on out was to Google the names of all prospective employees. Wow! With a simple name change, guy had a whole entirely different work life and personal life. It's like Severance, but for being a bad person. Story 14. About 6 years ago, we were hiring a new attorney at my law firm. One of the days of the interviews, one of our assistants started checking the prospective candidates' bar records. The state bar website provides each lawyer's disciplinary history, which is pretty important as a bit of information to check. And I can't figure out why no one bothered checking them before they invited candidates to interview. It turns out that one of the guys coming that morning for an interview had a disciplinary record and had previously been suspended for drug possession and use. My boss had his assistant call the guy and try and cancel the interview, but he had already left to come in. Apparently we had his home number and not a cell phone. My boss decided that he was obviously not going to hire this guy, so he had me conduct the interview instead. He didn't want him to have him come all the way in and then tell him immediately that we wouldn't be hiring him. The sad thing is that the guy's resume was impeccable. He genuinely knew our practice area. He really would have been a great addition to the firm, were it not for his inability to have kept his nose clean. Edit. I should clarify that it is not literally my law firm, but instead the law firm at which I am employed. I do not make the hiring decisions. Story 15. I work on Wall Street. One woman we were interviewing showed up a solid 40 minutes late for the interview, toting a big, huge, jumbo-sized soda and a bag of fast food, and admitted with a big smile that she was late because she had to have her fast food. You know how it is. She hadn't gotten lost. Her watch didn't break. The alarm did not go off. Nope, she made it clear that she just took her time at a Burger King. When my boss made it clear that she wasn't even going to be considered for the job at that point, she panicked, blamed our receptionist, saying that it took her a full 40 minutes to sign her in. Now that was a big fat lie, because 5 minutes before she showed up, I walked past reception on my way to the ladies' room, and she was not there. 5 minutes later, on my way back from the ladies' room, there she was at reception signing in. Again, a solid 40 minutes late. She was so late that my boss gave me the green light to show her the elevator before we even saw her. But when she tried to get our receptionist in trouble in order to cover her own butt, he tore into her a bit before she headed out. Story 16. I'm not a hiring manager, but I did interview him and was the person who Googled him. We were a small recruiting firm, and hiring a new person was a big deal. In walks Scumbag Steve. On his resume, he was a former MP who was doing recruiting for years, and even had his own firm for a bit in a different state. His story was that he decided to move and wanted to join an existing operation. Something about him felt off, and I voiced this to my boss, but a few others interviewed him and seemed to like him. So a few weeks passed, and he's constantly bragging about being in touch with this person or that, talking about his Mercedes. I never thought to Google him or check his history until he went a bit too far. He claimed that he was picked for some special committee at an Ivy League school for the specific field we did recruiting for. This guy had zero specific knowledge about the industry he recruited for, had no real connections to that Ivy League school, and the only one in the city for a few months. I called bullcrap. So I Googled his name, the committee's name, and the school just to see if there was a page on the members that I can cross-reference. Well, what do I find staring at me? A video and several articles with scumbag Stevie Boy being perp-walked in an orange jumpsuit. Not only did he never serve in the military as an MP, but the reason he left the city he was in was because he did time there. Why did he do time, you ask? He created a business commerce group dedicated to minority businesses and robbed the crap out of it. Refused to compensate anyone. He did 3 years and apparently never even so much as apologized. I dove deep, found my sources, and sent the info over to my boss because F that guy. He got fired like a day or two later, and I got to be there that day. Story 17. I was hiring for a city engineering position for a small municipality. Received an application packet from what seemed like the perfect candidate. He had held a similar position with a larger city. Well-written resume, and he interviewed quite well. He seemed just a little cagey about answering the "why did you leave your last position" question. On a hunch, I did a pretty deep Google search and found out that not only had he been fired from one previous local government job, he was the subject of so many hostile work environment and union grievance claims that the city he had last worked for basically paid him to quit. And on top of that, I found a blurb where another town's park and rec board had banned him from attending any of his kids' soccer games there for physically assaulting a ref. Never before or since have I shredded a resume with such intensity of purpose. Story 18. Oh man, finally a thread I have a good story for. I run a sales team, and one of my RVPs, Chuck, brought in a candidate that was very enthusiastic about. Let's call her Karen. Chuck, in a previous role, went up against Karen in deals all the time and said that Karen always pulled the deal out from him and she'd be a major asset. I met Karen, thought she was nice, but certainly didn't find her to be the typical quota killer. But Chuck was excited, and I tried to give my RVPs a lot of rope. So I checked a few references and did income verification, which all checked out. Background check was fine as well. Fast forward to Karen's first day. I immediately knew something was off. She was frantic, running around the office barefoot, wearing her glasses on the back of her head, dressed like someone out of a Little House on the Prairie, essentially not acting at all like someone who had the potential to make $500K that year. On her second day, our VP of marketing walked into my office and asked me what I thought of Karen. I responded that I thought she seemed a little nutty, but was trying to give her a shot. He then asked me to Google her name and the town she lived in. The results, to this day, are still some of the best Google gold I'd ever seen. Long story short, this woman was in the middle of a nasty divorce. Her husband was living with a family friend, and she tried to burn down the family friend's house in retaliation for letting him stay there, and had been arrested for attempted arson. This didn't pop up on the background check, as it happened a couple weeks prior to her starting. In addition to the arrest, the husband was granted a restraining order. This was enough grounds to terminate her, but it got better. 3 evenings prior to her first day with our company, she violated her restraining order and broke into her husband's car that she filled with ripped-up photos of them and a number of decapitated stuffed animals and doused his car in gasoline. She was arrested again for this act and then placed on house arrest with a GPS monitor. It turns out that she removed the monitor to come to work, which yielded in yet another arrest, but that wasn't until after I terminated her employment. Story 19. Was hiring a DJ for our wedding, went to a wedding expo and entered a few free drawings. Won a 50% off coupon for a newer DJ company. Money was tight. Quick Google of the company, checked out, semi-decent website and what seemed like legit reviews. Decided to go with the company. A lot of vendors require half payment for booking and half upon completion, so we cut the check. A few weeks later, the company makes the local news for double booking clients, taking money and not showing up, setting up at weddings but being completely trashed and rude and abusive. Call the owner. He attempts to assure me that this was his business partner, who he has now cut ties with. Wants to reassure me that everything will be so great he meets with us on a weekly basis and goes over every detail of the wedding and what music is being played and when. He actually called me to come to a local bar every now and then before the wedding even. Gave him the chance on a very short leash and a newly redesigned contract that specifically stated he would reimburse and pay for emotional damages if he failed the show. Everything turned out great, and it was one of the best nights of my life. Story 20. I was a waiter at Olive Garden during my F-up years, and there was a guy, fake name Jeff, in the same suburb who was significantly more of an F-up. We'd met, had mutual acquaintances, didn't really know each other. Then one time I'm hanging out with other people, and they're like, "Hey, did you hear that Jeff shot some dude in the balls?" What? Yeah, the dude's okay, but he's way harder than Jeff, and is probably going to kill him. A few months later, he comes in and applies to be a waiter at the OG. My bosses are like, "Jeff says he knows you, Robert. What can you tell us about him?" We're not super tight, but I know I wouldn't hire him. OG waiter training takes 2 weeks. Towards the end of it, you're given a partial section and the trainer kind of watches over it to keep you from effing up too bad. And most Olive Gardens are split, with dining areas on each side and the kitchen in the middle. You don't really have time to go back and forth, and you can help people on your side, but not people on the other. So Jeff is taking tables for the first time one night, and I'm on the other side of the restaurant with a larger than normal section. All of a sudden, he comes over to my side and he's like, "I got my first table. Robert, did you ever hear how I shot that guy in the balls once?" "Uh-huh. That's my table. He can't know I work here." "I don't know, man. Can you tell the trainer?" "But she doesn't know about the balls thing. You gotta take this table for me." "I can't, man. I'm over here. I got my other tables." I have no clue how that resolved, but I was busy till I went home. About 2 weeks later, I'm not working, and I don't hear about this till the next day. But he works until 9 or so and then heads out. After the restaurant closes, OG doesn't let employees back in, or leave one at a time for security reasons. About 30 minutes after close, Jeff and some other random guys start banging on the front door. "Hey, let us in. It's just me, bro." And the other guy's like, "Yeah, let us in. We have a gun. We're gonna rob you, see?" Jeff is upset and indicates this in 2 ways. "Hey man, don't tell them that. Now they're not going to open it." And punches Rando in the face. Rando is upset that Jeff punched him and punches Jeff back, but because they're both on drugs or some substance, they both fall down and now they're rolling around on the ground laughing and punching each other and bleeding out of their faces. The manager sent everyone to hide in the kitchen, called the cops, and by the time the cops got there, Jeff and Rando were gone. The next day, Jeff, no call, no shows. The day after, Jeff shows up to work, all rared up and ready to go, surprised that they're firing him. Hey, at Olive Garden, when you're here, you're family. But the employers are probably convicts. Story 21. I think I've posted this before, but it is worth sharing again. I was asked to do a technical interview of a candidate for a senior level position. I got his resume and it was very long, but he had a good experience. I am a serial Googler though. I Google everything I can find on most people. Within the first few searches I did, I got hits on government websites. Even more, it was for a federal case the candidate was involved in. I look into the case and find out that our candidate was the defendant in a federal trial for selling contracts at his prior employer or something to that effect. I did cross-reference to be sure it was him. Then I find out it was the result of a 1 or 1.5 year prison sentence in federal prison. Looking back at his resume, he was conveniently self-employed for that time. He had to have been released not more than a month or two prior. Now, at the time, I worked at a large Fortune 100 company. To get me to this guy would have already had to pass through a recruiting system and a recruiter. I informed the hiring manager that he was convicted of these crimes and asked if he knew. He didn't and was very upset. I told him that we needed to interview him anyway because if he passed the bar of the recruiting process, then we shouldn't make that part of our decision process. The guy interviewed really well. I recommended him for a hire and the hiring manager was impressed. Made him an offer. He rejected it to accept an offer from another company. I was a little shocked to find out that a man who was just released from prison turned us down because he had too many offers. Story 22. I worked as a tattoo artist a while back, and this guy was a dang near nightmare human. I have since had to quit due to health issues. I had to take some time off, again health related, so in the meantime they got someone to replace me. The guy's portfolio was good, had been tattooing for 9 years, already had a client base to bring with him. Unfortunately, the Googling came in a little too late. The first few months were good, but the guy slowly started getting lazy, canceling on clients, not showing up, booking clients in for full-day sessions, and after 2 hours of work, he'd tell them their skin wasn't tolerating being tattooed, that they were bleeding too much, so he could no longer continue. Instead of just charging for 2 hours, he'd still charge the full day rate and then take off without breaking down his workstation, or would sit on his phone watching Netflix for the rest of the day. He generally started getting lazy with wrapping his stuff, and other working on the shop would be reminding him that these things need to be done properly. At this point, I Googled the guy, and he posted a load of different tattoo sites begging for jobs, all with conflicting information about his background, like where he had worked previously and for how long. Something didn't add up, so I brought it to the attention of the shop manager, who by this point had plenty of complaints about the guy, but they decided to give the benefit of the doubt and kept him around, only asking him to improve on certain points. He did for a bit, but then started out tattooing young girls 18 to 19, and it wouldn't surprise me if they were underage as well, and was giving discounts to these girls in return for favors. When called out on it, he quit, came back during the night when everyone had gone home and stole over $800 worth of machines, ink, and other stuff, most of which belonged to me. Makes me mad just thinking about it. Story 23. We have a phone room at my office, and they will pretty much hire anyone with a pulse that's semi-warm. We get all kinds through here, so nothing really is a shock to us anymore. Until we got a new hire through a temp agency this summer, his application said that he was a felon and that he was in the wrong place at the wrong time. That didn't really matter because, like I said, we get all kinds. The problem became when one of the telemarketers decided to Google him, and we learned that wrong place at the wrong time was a bit of an understatement. He had just spent about 20 years in prison because he was found to have possibly murdered his sister during a night of drinking and then violated her corpse with Lincoln Logs. I repeat, violated her corpse with Lincoln Logs. When that was discovered, the manager downstairs had to sit him down and let him know that we had to let him go, as the other employees didn't feel comfortable or safe around him. And now we make a joke every once in a while when we get an offer, feeling that some of the new employees, if we think they're capable of Lincoln logging someone. Story 24. Oh boy, let's start by saying that we should have Googled him first. IT hired this guy to work in our team support, answering customer emails and phone calls. Dude was totally qualified, if you believe the resume, and basically a nice young kid. Exactly what we were looking for in a candidate. Before hiring, they had called references and had good replies. People said the usual stuff. He can lack motivation sometimes, showed up late a few times, but generally a solid guy. Flash forward to his first day. In training, he starts cussing like a sailor. By like noon, we're kind of laughing, but he answers the phone okay and directed the call. Then he responds to a customer email. Not been with us for 5 hours yet, by saying, "Crap be broke." Not cool. Just then, there's a banging on the front door and the admin answers it. "Is that effer Bill here? I'll kill him." Whoa. New guy has people that want to kill him? Dude is yelling and screaming, trying to push into the office more? We get that handled and get him outside. He starts telling us that Bill used to be his roommate and he stole some valuable paintings and other stuff. He's wanted by police and immigration. They want him deported again. Apparently, this dude saw Bill's card and was ready to throw down. We told Bill, we can't have that, and the crap broke comment. We told Bill, we can't have that with the crap broke comment, and he should not come back. Then we Googled him. It was all true and more. Had been deported twice, caught in an art theft ring, stolen couches and crap. Crazy stuff. So we all look at our IT director saying, you didn't even Google him? We Google all our prospective employees now. Story 25. Sort of tangentially related. Long story short, I was trying to convince someone that I'd met that someone could Google them and find out that they worked for Amway and that it would look bad. To provide an example, I Googled their name and found something worse. Long version, met this guy in a college class who was a bit awkward but seemed like he had a good head on his shoulders. Nice enough, just weird, Worked at KFC while going to school and loved the place. Always talked about it and how he wanted to go into marketing for them. Kind of odd, but whatever. Couple years later, I'm in KFC. He's there behind the counter. I ask him what's up, and he starts telling me how money was tight. He wasn't able to finish his college education yet. Conversation turns a bit, and suddenly it goes from money is tight to, yeah, I'm making a bunch right now with my own business. I make a mental note of that odd shift, but act nice, and he hands me an Amway business card. Oh, no. Normally I would be offended if someone tried to drag me into their Amway business, but this guy was, so I don't know. Simple isn't quite the right word, but simple that I felt bad for him. I had his email on the business card, which was very juvenile email address to have on a business card, so I put together an email. I spent an hour or so informing him of what Amway was and how I knew he valued his employment at KFC, so he shouldn't be handing out business cards on the job. I kept phrasing and rephrasing things, trying to be nice about it, trying to be helpful without being pushy. I got to a part where I said something like, and what happens if, in the future, you're looking for a job and someone Googles your name and your email address, then finding Amway might not look like good to you. Then, to provide an example, I Googled his name, Sex Offender Registry. Oof, I guess pyramid schemes are kind of the least of his worries. Story 26. Few years back, we hired some guy for foreign language tech support. These languages are quite niche, so we usually get them over quick, often without doing our normal due diligence for background checks. We have a team that takes about a month to 6 weeks to do the full check, but if a person says they are ready to go quickly and has the right skill set, we will bring them in sooner and continue the checks when they get here. Guy turns up, seems as decent as he did in the interview, so we get him into a bit of orientation training and away he goes. Our background check turns up nothing, so we think it's all good, until a guy on the team comes to our HR department to report that he has information about the guy. Turns out he was using a variant on his name that was also the variant on his passport. However, he had been convicted a few good years back under another variant of his name, in our country I might add, of essaying a 4-year-old girl. The guy on the team provided a newspaper article which was absolutely disgusting in the detail it went into, and it was definitely him. After many talks with our legal department, I am not in the US, so firing people is not as simple as you guys have it. We had to use performance reasons to get rid of the probation period, which was pretty shady in and of itself because he wasn't awful at the job itself. Some people, not many but some, may think it is harsh if he has served his time and is productive in his job, but we were close to having the whole department turn up with pitchforks and torches to drive him out before having a mass exodus on our hands. Effed up crap. Story 27. Company hired about 15 people for factory work. The company is union, but we are allowed 90 days to evaluate before they are allowed to join the union. So I give the orientation speech about coming to work in my department. About half the group is Hispanic, a few Asian, a few Caucasians, and one African American female. She showed up late for work her first day and 6 more days in her first month. Finally, she gets to my department. They shuffle the new hires around to get a feel for the entire place. Second day on the job in my department, she commits a major safety violation that only missed injuring a fellow employee because of his quick reaction, something that had been covered. Union employee submits information to me and I write her up. Does so again the very next day. Throwing broken glass over the top of someone's head into a waste receptacle. I call her into the office and tell her she's being sent home indefinitely. Only HR could actually terminate an employee. I'd sent all the formal counseling information along with the 2 write-ups along to HR. Open, shut, case. Something seemed fishy though, so I kept a copy of all the paperwork. 3 weeks later, I get a call to report to the plant manager's office. HR is sitting in there already. Plant manager asks me why I wanted her terminated, and I explained why. HR says we were being sued and would probably lose the case since there was no evidence of what I had stated. I ask about the write-up paperwork along with the statements from the other employees. HR has this crap-eating grin, says he's never seen any of that paperwork. I get an even bigger crap-eating grin and tell him it's a good thing. I kept copies of it all. He gets mad, tells me company rules prohibit me from keeping any of that paperwork and I could be terminated for it. I explained I had checked and there was one exception. If I retained the paperwork for training purposes, as in the new hourly supervisors I had recently hired on, plant managers had been silent through this whole exchange. At first he had an angry look on his face, but as I was able to burn the HR head, he started smiling. Ended with her being fired and the HR head was asked to stay in manager's office for a little talk. He amazingly enough decided it was time to retire. I heard through the employee grapevine he was having an affair with that employee's mom at the time. Story 29. I worked at a Chuck E. Cheese as an assistant for the manager, basically an intern for the summer. He had me help out with some job hires so we could fill the extended work schedule for 4th of July weekend. He lined up a few people who he asked me to look into as cursory search so he would know who was worth a full background check. I looked into a list of about 20 people. We are in a high residential neighborhood with a very large graduating senior class from the local high school, along with some college student. Most of them seemed alright. Some had some small priors like shoplifting or public intoxication, so after some skulking on people's Facebook pages to figure out who they are, I need to explain something really quick for this next part. We are one of the older Chuck E. Cheeses in the state, and we still have some of the old animatronics on display, though we just call them the robots because it's easier. Anyway, there was this one guy who we had lined up. As far as I could tell, he was mostly alright, having worked in fast food before and not being fired from said previous job, so he was pretty good compared to the rest of them. Let's call this guy Chad. So about 3 weeks left until the 4th of July, we had hired Chad and the two girls that we'll call Stacy and Beth. Due to some recent vandalism problems with our drive though, were offering overtime with extra pay to whoever would be willing to stay overnight to keep a lookout for the vandals. This guy Chad literally jumps up to volunteer. The manager agrees, puts this guy up in the manager's office. Mind you, his job at night was literally only to sit in the office, hold down the fort, make sure no one spray paints male private parts on the side of the building. Here's where I made a mistake. This guy, Chad, turns out he was one of those Five Nights at Freddy's nutcases who obsessed over the game. Now I want you to take a second and consider what we let happen. We let a 19-year-old guy obsessed with FNAF be alone in a pizzeria at night, alone with animatronics who are still attached to power from the floor that make noises at night, alone, again. So the next morning I came in early to check on the guy, and the first thing I see when I walk in is one of the robots straight up not on the stage, which not surprisingly completely effing floored me. The other two robots were beat up and the other one on drums was missing his head. I found Chad in the manager's office having an anxiety attack on the floor, clutching a fire extinguisher and having bloodied his hands. Once I get the guy off the floor and cleaned up, more or less, he tells me the robots attacked him, which is impossible due to the dang sprockets holding those mother effers to the stage, and of course, them being machines. Turns out the guy basically with his bare hands ripped the effing robot out of the stage and threw it behind the basketball hoop machines, and then beat down the others, which explained the bloody hands. After calling forward and telling Stacy, Beth, and the manager to not freak out when they walk in the front door, I had to take Chad to the hospital. When I got back, Stacy and the manager were already there, and Beth was pulling in behind me. We all just looked at what this dumb idiot did and sized up how the heck we were going to fix this. It eventually came down to firing Chad, charging him for repairs, $17,000, calling corporate to see if they could help, and hoping that they could get it fixed before the weekend. All in all, it ended sort of okay. It was a weird bonding experience for the four of us. Although Beth had to leave a month after to go back to college, me, Stacy, and the manager all had fun telling the new hires from then on the story of the one night at Chucky's. Story 30. These aren't direct answers to the questions, but very relevant. I have two incidents. Incident 1. Potential employee is being interviewed by the software company I work for and is asked about relevant interests and hobbies he has. Dude goes on to brag about a Juarez site he runs, yes, it was that long ago, and how he's got a bunch of our latest games on said site. Interview was cut short and the dude was obviously not hired. Incident 2. I worked with an East Indian, relevant later. Dude will call Bob for 10 plus years. After a couple of years, he leaves for another job, or so I thought. A couple of years ago, I see that Bob has come back. Bob was a cool dude, so I was happy to see him, and I'm chatting with one of my old managers, who also worked with me and Bob 10 years ago, and I mention how great it is that Bob is back. Manager doesn't know who I'm talking about until I refresh his memory. Manager's face goes stone cold. He tells me he has to go. Bob's been blacklisted. He can't be here. Turns out Bob reapplied after years using his East Indian name, which is how he got around being blacklisted. Manager obviously got him fired and removed him from the premises ASAP, but wouldn't tell me what he did to get blacklisted. Ooh-wee-oo. What did Bob do? Everybody feel free to theorize down below. What could you do to be blacklisted from a software company? Story 31. This has nothing to do with hiring, but is a similar situation. I used to work for a business loan agency specializing in small businesses. We had a guy trying to apply for a loan with us for the max amount of $100,000. I looked over his business, his tax returns, his bank statements, etc., and everything was looking good to fund him. I don't remember why I did it, but I googled the dude's name. Let's call him Sam Sanders. The first thing that came up was a news story. The article talked about how a Sam Sanders had been arrested for extortion, property damage, assault, and kidnapping, or something similar. That's weird. I think to myself, what are the odds? I keep reading. Sam is being accused of extorting multiple employees of his company. Sanders Stone works, who came to collect payment for a job they say he failed to make good on. One former employee reported that upon requesting payment, Sanders grew agitated, striking the employee multiple times in the face and body. When the employee began to resist, Sanders forced the man into the passenger seat of the employee's own truck and began to drive the vehicle without the owner's consent. During the drive, Sanders told the employees that if they requested payment again, he would inflict more bodily harm on the victim. I was aghast. The article went on like that for a while with multiple employees' stories. Me. My client's name is Sam Sanders. The company he is trying to get a loan with is Sanders Stoneworks. I checked the date of the article. It was only a week old. Immediately, I send the link to the article with my supervisor. You're gonna want to see this. Minutes later, a company-wide email goes out to advise that Sam Sanders is blacklisted from applying for a loan at our company permanently. They suspected he was trying to take the money and run. Story 32. Last year, I was reviewing resumes for a pretty high-level sales position. Expected salary was somewhere in the $120K range for top performers, so we were being very scrupulous about who we chose. I get a resume from a guy who has about 18 years of experience in high-level executive positions at various Fortune 100 companies. This, obviously, immediately set off a lot of alarm bells. But I started Googling him, and he checked out to be totally legitimate, and was actually the VP of the area real estate of a multi-billion-dollar telecom company. I verified his background and everything was a go, until something in me noticed his address as a location nearby here in San Diego. I googled the address and found a phone number. I called and learned that it was to a halfway house. Not immediately disqualifying, but definitely unusual. I did some additional research and located an old article that outlined his full legal name. Googled the full name, and he had a habit of getting drunk, coming into the office, and beating up his receptionists. The companies he worked for spent a lot of money trying to make that go away, but some brave blogger made sure to still see the light of day if you Google him. I let HR know what I had found and let them know that for reasons, I'm out. Story 33. This one will probably get buried, but here it goes. I worked for a pseudo-shady third-party Verizon retailer, and the story is about the best-ranked salesperson in our region. A year or so after hiring the guy, a Google search turned up a PDF court case with details of his prior discharge from the police force. Turns out this guy went to a strip club in his police car, but out of uniform. He goes in, starts harassing a black woman who was a patron at the club with her husband. He starts calling her names, proceeds to start beating her in the back of her head. When the woman and her husband leave, he follows them into the parking lot, pulls his firearm on them, and then tells them to get on the ground face down with their hands behind their heads. He continues to harass them until he hears police sirens approaching, all in a PDF easily found with a Google search. But he was a good salesperson and the retailer was pretty shady, so they promoted him to manager even after discovering all of this. Story 34. Now I've got a good one. So I have this older lady apply for a full-time position. She seems great on paper, right? Great on the telephone. When I talk to her, she's a decent interview, though a little evasive about her prior work as a lawyer. So we literally just Google her name, and the results are pages and pages and pages about what a crook and terrible lawyer she is. Basically stole from people and half did the cases, or even failed to show up for court at all. She had her butt sued off and had to close her law firm, and we never called her back. It seems to me that if you are desperate for a job, you'd be honest about why you're in the situation you're in. I have another, but it didn't involve Googling, so not as relevant. Really liked this guy for a stocking position at work. I see he used another employee, a supervisor, as a reference, so I asked them about the guy. They say he's great, and they would hire him. So I go ahead, background check, comes back as a non-hireable. So I ask the supervisor if they know what's up. They tell me the guy got arrested for beating his girlfriend in the parking lot at the job they worked at with him, and they had no idea why I was going to hire him. I never trusted that supervisor for a reference again. Story 36. Not exactly a we Googled them before story, more like we Googled them after. 2 years ago, I was working for a manufacturer. We were starting a satellite sales office in another state to service a few local accounts. The company policy is to hire receptionists and other support staff through staffing service companies. The rationale is that it gives the employer a period of time, 3 to 6 months, to evaluate a person before offering them a full-time job. And it also makes it easier to fire them if they don't fit. Just one call to the staffing service. The other side of doing business this way is that you don't really spend as much time evaluating the person before they start, as you expect the staffing service to send you qualified candidates. And many of the people employed by staffing services either don't have a solid work history or have very little experience. The nice lady, early 40s, we hired for the first reception position was from another part of the country. She had recently relocated to this area to be closer to other family members. We also had hired a draftsman who was a recent graduate of a local trade school. He was in his early 20s, married with a newborn. About a month into the receptionist starting to work with us, one Sunday afternoon, the general manager and lead draftsman started receiving explicit text messages and screenshots from Facebook Messenger on their company cell phones. It turned out that the draftsman and receptionist had been having a relationship via Facebook and some other messaging application. Some pretty explicit dialogue, no photos, included in some of the text from the draftsman's wife was a link to a news story about the receptionist who had been dismissed from working in a similar position at a municipal government office for having been involved in an extramarital affair with another city employee. Story 37. Okay, so I'm not an employer and we didn't Google her, but I had a manager that turned out to be crazy and got herself fired. She told us about her life all the time, unprompted. So this woman came into the company as a manager with experience. I was the last new hire before she joined the team. I worked one day off in her first couple of days, then came back. Except that's not what happened. I spent my first days learning how the store works, cookie place in a mall, want home, enjoyed my weekend off, realize I don't have my schedule for the next few weeks, and no one's number to call for it. So I go up to the store and find out the new GM is upset because I no-call and no-showed, because she changed the schedule the night before and didn't say anything. So we smooth out the understanding. With my schedule, I go on my way. In the 4 months I worked there, she, almost constantly, changed the schedule multiple times, sometimes in the middle of the week it applied to, and left different copies scattered around. She never told anyone she was changing it, and when we double-checked, we couldn't figure out which one was the right one. People were constantly showing up on days off, not coming in at the wrong times because she refused to make a schedule and stick with it. Forced us to make way more of a cookie than we could possibly sell before we had to trash it, and refused to let us make enough of another. Think 10 trays of strawberry sparkle. Who's gonna eat that? No one. It sounds weird. And 1 tray of chocolate chip, which we sold the most of by far. AM, who'd been there for 5 years and knew the store like the back of her hand, was brushed off when she tried to help. We constantly ran out of supplies. We used dozens of times a day, pan liners, cookie bags, sometimes the cookie dough itself, because the GM didn't like AM, because AM had seniority and we liked her more, and would deliberately not follow her advice just to show that she knew better. She would then have to drive to another store an hour away for an emergency pickup of their supplies. That was just how she sucked at her job. Here's how she was crazy. Had 6 kids with 3 or 4 different dudes. They all lived with her boyfriend of less than a year, who she was constantly pressuring to get married. Claimed her boyfriend, and later her kids too, saw demons in the shadows, faces on the walls. He drew one of these faces once. She showed me the picture. Standard lion's head with goat horns, video with a shadow that might be shaped like a person if you tilted your head and squinted both your eyes, you name it, the whole shebang. Missed work. We couldn't get a hold of her either, because her boyfriend got arrested for a traffic violation. I think they skipped court. Had a warrant out for her arrest as well. Got arrested, was evicted while gone, and ended up in a tent with their ex-boyfriend's backyard. The kids were in the house. I forgot to add, she was pressuring her boyfriend to get married because she, honest to goodness, had a gut feeling that the world was going to end soon. And believed she could cast hundreds of demons from her house with her faith because she's an excellent Christian, right? Also constantly claimed her ex were trying to kill her and that she was 5 foot and 100 pounds soaking wet, fought him, 6'3" and built, and she won, so she got to keep the truck. After I quit, she got married on a Sunday, no call, no show to work the next day, and was fired because they were sick of her crap and waiting for a reason. Story 39. A few years back, I was contracting at a major Air Force base. I had written an application that was part of the logon script that helped with the patch compliance. Every login, it would audit the workstation or server and attempt to fix issues if it was configured to do so. It provided reliable and provable compliance data to Air Combat Command and was a huge success. There was talk about deploying it at other bases. Fast forward a few years and I'm working for another government agency. We get the resume of a guy who will be separating from the Air Force soon. Management sees that he is stationed at the base I was contracting at previously and shows his resume to me. There I see that he is claiming that he wrote my application and that he got all kinds of awards and recognition for it. So of course we'd call him in for an interview and I'm on the interview team. Everything goes nicely until we get near the end and I drop the bomb. So it says here that you wrote a program called Nicer. Can you tell me about that and the process you used to develop it? He stammers that it's just a login script that audits workstations. It's not really that big of a deal. At that point, I described the splash page where Nicer runs, the language I used, the server names, and even the passwords for everything. I wish I had a camera because there was really no way to describe the look on his face. He just sat there and eventually said, oh crap, you're him? Yep, I'm not getting the job, am I? No. Story 40. I'm the office manager at an auto glass shop, and our company wanted to hire a salesperson. We interviewed an older gentleman who seemed to have a great resume with lots of experience. I always got a weird vibe from him, however. Thought he was kind of creepy, but just thought he was a weird old dude. After he had been with us a couple months, we get an email from a local insurance agent who said, if this is the type of person your business associates with, you won't be hearing from me or my clients. And he attached a link to this guy's sex offender registry, where he was cited for intimacy with a minor. We are in a fairly small town, and after some digging around, we found out he had essayed 2 boys under the age of 14. I guess the owners didn't do a check on him because he came with so much experience. So my weird feelings I had about him were validated, and this guy apparently told the owner it wasn't true over and over and over again, said he was set up or something. After a very long conversation behind closed doors with the owner, we left very quickly. Very awkward. 10 out of 10, will Google all future possible employees myself next time. Story 41. As usual, late for the show, but stay with me, because this is a new model of defrauding people. Not my own hiring story, but of a close friend and colleague of mine. He needed another doctor on his team, writing reviews and building a paper trail, and advertised for a senior consultant with an emergency medicine and critical care background. Good positions with an extremely competitive salary. He got through the applications, and one guy really was top-notch. Former lead of emergency medicine in a big hospital, lots of publications, etc. So everything looked pretty good. He invited the guy, interview was good, but my friend was a bit taken aback by something. Not a specific thing, but only a general feeling he wanted to investigate more. So he offered to have lunch at a posh restaurant, but even then he couldn't get to it. When they leave the restaurant, an old woman falls down the steps to a parking lot and suffers an open fracture. My buddy hurries to assist her, while the applicant just gets very nervous, and more nervous. He clearly has no idea what to do. And while the ambulance crew arrives, he simply vanished. Further investigation finds out that the person whose resume it was never quit his job at the major hospital and did not look like the applicant at all. So we will never know who that person was who basically committed identity theft in a huge scale. Story 42. Not the hiring manager, but I was involved in the recruitment process. Had a candidate who seemed really good on paper, plenty of relevant experience, qualifications, all the jazz. Hiring manager thought the name sounded familiar, but couldn't quite place it. I was tasked with conducting the reference check. The reference I called sounded in a good mood when I started the call, but noticeably tensed up when I said the name of the candidate. He went from, "Sure, happy to help. I'll tell you as much as I can," to, "I can confirm that they worked here between X and Y date in that role," and wanted to end the call. I reported this back to the hiring manager, who did some searching. We found reports that the candidate had tried to sue their previous employer for unfair dismissal and lost in spectacular fashion. The publicly available transcripts had some highlights like a mediator chosen by the candidate, known for being very anti-corporation, pro-employee, claiming that the employer's actions were reasonable and that the candidate had an exaggerated sense of importance, thinking that rules everybody in that industry needs to follow do not apply to them, and so on. Story 43. Hi, kind of related. I work for a company, and our entire job is teaching people how to manage their social media and what not to do on it. While none of our clients are this level of terrible, we have to be clear anyone for certain types of crimes before taking them on as a client. You'd be amazed the kind of stuff people just don't get. Overall, we help clients set up and manage websites and social media accounts so they can create a strong online presence and personal brand. And most people don't know how to do this or don't have the time. We also go to colleges and talk about not posting dumb stuff online, have an online service that crawls your social media and flags and posts that you should delete. Our company actually got started because our founder wasn't getting hired for anything and didn't know why. So he Googled his name and found out a guy his age with his same name was busted on possession of a ridiculous amount of drugs, and people thought he was that guy. So he decided to help out people who don't understand the SEO side of things like this or don't have a strong online presence. It's honestly really fun work. But yeah, I see it every day because we have people come to us who have pretty bad Google results. There are also a lot of sketchy companies out there who promise to delete posts online for a ridiculous amount of money and end up scamming a lot of people. The industry of online reputation management is super weird.